What is the strangest way that anyone could die? Perhaps crushed by an avalanche while scaling Everest, maybe impaled by a rogue meteorite or torn apart by a rare and vicious animal attack. Well, if you had asked the ancient Greeks, they would have told you without hesitation that the greatest philosopher ever to grace the earth met his end in a manner both dumber and more humiliating than all of those put together. He died laughing at a donkey. Welcome to my channel. It's time to meet the man who laughed himself to death. Chrysippus was one of the most prolific writers of the Hellenistic period, and despite losing nearly all of his work to antiquity's relentless march of time, enough remains to show that he was not only a highly respected Stoic philosopher but also one of the greatest logicians the ancient world had ever seen. In fact, it was his astounding ability to construct arguments with razor-sharp precision that gained him his most enduring piece of notoriety, being labeled the laughing philosopher. It all started when someone brought a donkey into the school of philosophy that Chrysippus taught at. Now, you might be thinking that bringing a stubborn and braying jackass into a place of learning was pretty dumb. But remember, this was ancient Greece, where even the most mundane things could be teaching moments. For example, Plato once used a ring of gold to illustrate the concept of justice, so perhaps Chrysippus saw some greater truth hidden within the donkey's unassuming exterior. Whatever his reason, he decided to use the beast in a demonstration of his unique style of argumentation. So what happened next? Well, according to the ancient sources, he tied a fig to the tail of the donkey, then invited his students to come see something hilarious. When the donkey brayed, the fig would fall off its behind, and upon doing so would roll over, exposing the ass's rear end to the audience. It was so funny that Chrysippus literally died of a heart attack laughing. That is the basic version of the story, but there are a few different variants and embellishments depending on which author you read, so let me tell you about them now. Most of our ancient accounts come from Roman sources, so it's possible that they are repeating stories that were embellished or distorted through Greek retellings. Our earliest source is a letter written by Roman philosopher Pliny the Younger to his friend and fellow senator, Borvius Mesa. So he described his habits and hobbies so that Mesa would know how to entertain him. Pliny tells us that Chrysippus was a lover of figs, so much so that he always carried dried figs with him. He would eat them after washing them in vinegar and wiping them with a cloth. But his favorite thing to do was to take fresh figs and carefully remove the skin from their flesh. Then he would place these peeled figs on the end of his cane and walk around the streets of Athens, pretending that he was about to cast them into the river. We don't know why he did this, but clearly it was another example of his absurd sense of humor. According to Pliny, Chrysippus was fond of jests, witticisms, and puns. He liked nothing better than to make people laugh, but his most common joke was a play on words using the name of a person called Coron. Apparently, Coron was a miserly old man who was famous around town for his mean streak and his habit of never tipping his donkey driver. One day, Chrysippus was walking down the street when he heard a commotion. Looking around, he saw that a group of boys had surrounded Coron and were throwing stones at him. Without hesitation, Chrysippus grabbed a stone and hurled it at the old man's donkey. When the animal fell to its knees, the boys burst out laughing. It was at that moment that Chrysippus knew he had to make this simple donkey incident into something greater, something worthy of the crowd's attention. So he walked up to the boys and asked them why they were torturing the poor animal. They told him that they were punishing the donkey for stealing bread from their school, at which point Chrysippus revealed that the owner of the donkey was none other than Charon himself, the very same man who wouldn't even give his driver a copper coin. Of course, the boys couldn't help but laugh at this news, so Chrysippus joined in. He laughed so hard, in fact, that his face turned red and he collapsed onto a nearby bench. After catching his breath, he stood up and continued strolling through the city. According to Pliny, it was about a half mile into his walk when he came across a fig tree. Picking a ripe fig from the branch, he proceeded to peel it the same way that he had been doing earlier and placed it on the tip of his cane. Then he began to retrace his steps, still chuckling to himself. When he reached the spot where he had fooled the boys, he pretended to throw the fig into the river. But before it hit the ground, he pulled it back and shouted, "Hey, wait a minute," because it was right at that moment that the boys had left off to go buy themselves some bread. When the donkey heard this, it brayed loudly, causing the fig to fall off its tail and roll over, revealing the animal's backside. The boys were gone, but their donkey driver was still there. Seeing this, Chrysippus doubled over in laughter, overwhelmed with mirth. He fell to the ground and kicked his sandals off as he let out one final bellow, and that's when he suffered a heart attack and died. I know this story sounds ridiculous, but there's no reason to doubt that it's based on a real event. Chrysippus was a historical figure whose death caused a sensation throughout the ancient world. If this particular story wasn't true, it would have been easy for later philosophers to dismiss it as pure fiction. But the fact that they engaged with it on multiple occasions proves that it was widely believed to be true. However, there's good reason to think that the details of the story may have changed. For example, Plutarch makes a similar claim about Chrysippus, but instead of a donkey, he says that it was a mule that made him laugh. Diogenes Laertius agrees with Plutarch that it was a mule and adds that Chrysippus was demonstrating the power of language to move people emotionally. He supposedly said, "Words are like weapons and can inflict wounds." To prove this, he used a mule as his shield and dodged blows from sticks wielded by angry bystanders until he died. Later, we have the medieval philosopher Albertus Magnus, who says that Chrysippus was killed by laughter while watching a dog try to bury a dead cat, but that maybe you should just take everything medieval philosophers say with a grain of salt. But regardless of whether it was a donkey, a mule, or a dog that caused his death, what does this embarrassing accident tell us about Stoicism? As the founder of the Stoics, Zeno famously told his followers to avoid pleasure and pain, fear and desire alike. After all, the goal of Stoic philosophy was to live in harmony with nature by accepting whatever fate throws your way. Surely, a devoted Stoic wouldn't collapse and die simply because he found something funny. Well, you should keep in mind that Chrysippus was considered a martyr by Stoics, because he refused to stop teaching and writing philosophy when the Syrian king ordered him to stop. So it was certainly not weakness that led to his demise. What's more, the Stoics weren't opposed to emotions in general, only passions that caused us to lose our virtue and rational control. Laughter is a natural response to finding something amusing, and it doesn't seem to have caused any harm. So what's the problem? Well, we have to ask ourselves, did Chrysippus really laugh himself to death? Or did he die of a heart attack coincidentally while laughing? If the former, then it was only because his laughter was so powerful that it physically overwhelmed him. That seems a bit unlikely. But in any case, this story helps us understand the limits of Stoicism. Life can often be funny and engaging, but it can also be depressing, painful, and tedious. Sometimes we need to laugh, cry, or scream at the world in order to cope with it. We must find our own balance between embracing life's ups and downs. Even a great Stoic philosopher like Chrysippus could succumb to uncontrollable laughter, showing us that nobody is immune to the complexities and contradictions of human emotion. You know, Chrysippus wasn't the only philosopher with a strange exit strategy. His older contemporary, Empedocles, was allegedly swallowed whole by Mount Etna during one of its violent volcanic eruptions. Then there's the Pythagorean, who supposedly died peacefully while listening to a friend recite poetry. However, that's not actually what happened. He stepped on a scale to weigh himself and it tipped over, so he choked to death on his beans. Some people just can't escape their habits, you know. Now we'll never know exactly how many of these stories are true. Most of them come from secondary sources written long after the philosophers in question had died. Often the authors are playing up the drama of the narrative, which makes it hard to separate fact from myth. But in the case of Chrysippus, I think it matters little whether or not he died laughing at a donkey. The important thing is that we still tell this story today, because it resonates with our experiences. Death, whether swift and tragic or long and painful, is something that everyone fears. And the prospect of dying in a humiliating or undignified way is especially terrifying. Chrysippus's death tickles our funny bone because it's absurd, unexpected, and strangely relatable. It reminds us that however much we plan for the future, life rarely goes according to plan, and even the greatest philosophers are unimmune to life's cruel jokes. And that's why this story of the laughing philosopher continues to endure thousands of years after he first breathed his last. Thank you so much for watching. If you're like me, you probably love weird philosophical stories about death. So go ahead and drop a comment down below about the most unusual way that you could imagine dying. It could be anything you want, realistic or completely absurd. I love reading your comments. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.